Good afternoon, everyone. It is now 3 p.m. and welcome. I'm Ming Chow. I'm senior lecturer at the Department of Computer Science. And I said I wouldn't miss the world for this. And what a fantastic event it is. So now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce the next panel on export control. Just a real brief summary, just a real brief abstract. We have physical export control, with like weapons. That's generally understood. But what about when it comes to software? What happens if the software is malicious? What do we do about that? And it is absolutely my pleasure and honor to introduce to you three luminaries who are going to be on this panel and speaking about this topic. First, we have Joe Trachtman. He is the co-director for the Center of International Law and Governance and professor of international law at Tufts, Fletcher. Next, we have Herb Lin, senior research scholar for cyber policy and security at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, CSAC, at Stanford University. Finally, we have Jonathan Zittrain, the George Bemis Professor of International Law, and also co-founder and faculty director at the Berkman Center at Harvard University. And, okay, so it's all yours. Yeah.
All right, well, okay. What I was lovely, I was showing this clock here, which looks analog, but in fact, it doesn't tick. It's entirely digital on the inside. There's a lesson in that. Okay, so we're talking about how to use export controls to make cyber defense better. And the idea, fundamentally, the idea behind export controls is that you don't want to give dangerous technology that could be used for bad purposes. You don't want to give them to the bad guys who have less advanced capabilities than you do. Okay, there's a, so it's fine to export stuff to allies, known good guys, and then you don't want to do it to give potentially dangerous technology to the bad guys. And it's probably important to distinguish between, they're bad guys in what sense? Are they going to use the stuff that you give them on their own citizens or on people non-indigenous citizens, that is, people outside their country? And the first is a question of trying to protect human rights. The second is a question of trying to sort of preserve peace and goodwill and non-conflict everywhere else. Now, the effectiveness of export controls depends on availability of the technology and the scope of the controls that you have. Availability of relevant technologies, obviously, if they have lots of other sources for the same technology, similar technology that you might be selling them, it doesn't work very well. So you'd like to be able to get the technology controlled by everybody, get a cartel essentially to pull together all of the suppliers of it and say, we all agree not to sell it to the bad guys except under certain circumstances. This isn't going to stop the bad guy states, the four bad actors in the world, but maybe has some marginal effects and so on. On intrusion software, this is the focus here. This has been the focus of some export control attempts and law in the United States since 2013 or so. Intrusion software essentially enables the user to intrude into computer systems and networks. The user may be a government user, and the networks that are intruded upon may be civilian networks. So that's the locus of. That's the focus. That's why this fits into this workshop. Software is obviously very hard to control. Software is made out of bits, right? And tanks and jet fighters are made out of atoms, and borders are more naturally resistant to atoms than they are to bits. Furthermore, software is you can transfer it free, right? Transferring a bit is virtually costless. It's hard to tell what bits do until you assemble them all together, and there's no natural border control there. And of course, software development and defense, cyber defense and so on are global. So you need to be able to control the cross-border movement. Now, the definition of the stuff that we're talking about is intrusion software. That's the item of concern. I don't want to read all of this. This is the US government definition of it. It's important to distinguish between two categories that people talk about in this. One that the export controls talk about. One is the category of intrusion software, and then there's a collateral category, which systems specially designed for the modification, specially designed or modified for the generation of or delivery of communication with intrusion software. That is, it's not intrusion software per se, it is, intrusion-related software. And the interesting part is that the export controls that have been proposed regulate the collateral category. They don't regulate intrusion software per se. Okay, they regulate just the collateral category. For example, software toolkits that somebody can use to make intrusion software. That's often sold to law enforcement and so on. Software technology involved in the development of intrusion software, automatic exploit generation, something like that. Okay. Why control intrusion-related software rather than intrusion software? The idea is that you cast a smaller net with that. It's an attempt. You could argue about how effective, but it's an attempt to prevent overreach. Because otherwise, if you regulated intrusion software per se, you'd capture things that you didn't necessarily want to capture. So when you think about this problem, if you want to think about enforcement, okay, so the idea behind enforcement here is that if I sell it if I export it to a good guy, presumably, how do I know that that good guy doesn't give it to a bad guy? Okay, so the U.S. sells it to China, and some entity in China, and this other entity in China sells it to somebody else, or I mean, even to, for example, well, okay. So it's the question of how do you prevent the secondary transfer, because it doesn't just die after the first transfer, right? And so this brings up the question of software provenance. And fundamentally, the question about software provenance is that how can I trace the development of I identify some software out there and I don't know where it came from. And it does something bad. And it sort of looks very suspiciously like it does something that was similar to the software that I sold to this company X, right? How do I tell, or can I tell, whether that software really came from X? Is it the same in some sense of the term, for some definition of similar, and how similar is it? That's the question. Okay? And in practice here, the idea is that, if we be more precise about it, I'm going to define what I call as a software object, okay, that I find on a system somewhere else. This is the thing whose provenance I'm trying to track. Okay? And then, is it similar to the original that I know that I've sold to this, that I've originally let out? Okay? And how do I make that determination of similarity? And that's obviously going to be a judgment call, right? This is important because once you make the judgment call that these two are essentially the same or similar enough to raise concerns, then you say, aha, this guy that I sold the software to did something bad, okay? And now I don't have to sell him software anymore. Okay, so, or I can invoke some penalty or something like that. But that's the logic behind it. Two fundamental approaches to determining provenance. One is what I'm going to call taking a brushstroke approach, which is that you may know that you can often determine the origin, the original painter of a painting by virtue of the brushstrokes in it. Are those brushstrokes similar, and this unknown painting similar to paintings that are known to have been created by the same guy? To use that analysis to say, these are similar enough to say they're the same. Okay, nobody uses this particular depth and whirl of the brush and so on. And there are analogous ways of doing that with software. There are techniques that that look at programming style, for example, or the program features in code that are preserved when even after you transformed it to some extent. And what you get out of this is 17 different metrics, and you say that this software in question is similar to the original software. On metric 1, it's 76% similar, and software number on metric number 2, it's 98% similar, and so on. Okay, and out of that you render a judgment. Okay, notice it's a judgment. It's not unambiguous, and it's therefore in some sense political. Right, you make somebody has to make a judgment about what is the threshold of similarity that you need to make. Another technique, which is sometimes called watermarking. The phrase watermarking turns out to be ambiguous in the literature, but I'm using it here in the sense of a watermark that you add to paper. Okay, in paper there's a watermark inside the piece of paper that is supposed to be reproducible if you Xerox it or something like that. You have those, sometimes you get a draft paper and it has, in light print, it says draft in big gray letters. You can still read everything, but it says draft on it. Okay? And then the question is, and that way you know it's draft. And every time you copy that paper, the word draft appears. Okay? And that's, that's the kind of watermark that you mean. And so what you would want to do, if you were a thief and you wanted to do something unauthorized with that draft, steal it or something like pretend that it was final, you'd find a way to take off that word draft on that document. Right? That's what you would try to do. And there are analogous ways of doing that in software. So just as the simplest sort of thing, I can put in a 100-digit code number inside the code, some special number, secret code number inside the code. And every time somebody copies it, they copy that code number. Okay? And if I see that 100-digit code number in the subsequent software, I say, aha, that's the same. It's the same software. Or I could make that claim, okay, with some credibility. And it's not a judgment call. That's unambiguous. That software, 100 digits, the likelihood of 100 digits, same 100 digits being found in sequence is essentially 0. So I can say they're the same. Now, of course, this has a really basic problem with it. This approach, okay. If the guy knows that you've got that 100-digit code number in there, he'll try to take it out. Okay? And so, just like if he doesn't know about the word draft in the document, it's okay. But if he does know about it, he'll find a way to take it out. Okay? And so there, the game is trying to figure out what sorts of things will be preserved unambiguously over, from copy to copy. Object code is harder to determine provenance of than source code. The difference between object code and source code is that source code is what the human being writes when he's writing a program. Object code is what is after a computer turns that into ones and zeros. That's the object code side of the house. And you can imagine that it might be more difficult to determine provenance for ones and zeros than it is for something that's written by humans. Not impossible, as it turns out, but it is still harder. With that technical background, I give to Joel for some legal analysis.
Thank you, Herb. We went back and forth as to what the order of our presentations should be. I think you could do the technical part first and the legal part second, or vice versa. But the idea is to try to integrate them to see how the technical part forms a constraint or an opportunity in connection with what you'd like to achieve from a legal standpoint. And this is an area of, as Herb said, where the idea is to limit the availability of certain dangerous tools. And it's possible to do it at different levels of society. Individual firms could do it themselves, but then they make similar things, and so they might get together as a group, as an industry association, like the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, and say, let's coordinate, let's solve the collective action problem that we would otherwise have, which grows as you withhold software or other goods from folks because it becomes more valuable to them. And so we have at least some beginning in the Cybersecurity Tech Accord that says we won't help governments launch cyber attacks. One thing that I think is a bit counterintuitive in this area is that you're trying to restrict access to governments. Cybercrime by private actors is kind of a separate issue, but you could imagine circumstances where you'd, of course, want to restrict these tools from the hands of private actors. And then you could have domestic law in particular places. As the Cold War proceeded, the United States wanted to deny certain weapons to its competitors, the Soviet Union, and it developed export controls, and then it turned around and said, well, we need to coordinate with other governments and develop the COCOM at that time, replaced by the Wassenaar arrangement, to try to overcome the collective action problem among governments. So we'll look briefly at the Wassenaar arrangement, which is a coordinating device at US and EU rules. And one of the things that Herb adverted to, which I think is critical, and we've already kind of mentioned it, is that these rules in this area where software is so fleet, so possible to move from one place to another without goods having to cross borders, without that customs official having to look at them, it's tough to impose territorial controls. It's not impossible, but it's tough. And so the question that we raise in our paper is whether you could, instead of focusing on territoriality, on geography, whether you could focus on the recipient and have certain trusted recipients, along with recognizing that there are still governments involved that have territorial power over those recipients, and you need the cooperation of those governments in order to make effective your desire to send things to those recipients that you otherwise would trust. So the idea of our paper is a kind of verified end user, somebody who can receive the software, and at the end I'll talk about some of the conditions under which someone might be considered a verified end user. So as I said, industry standards seem like they solve a collective action problem, but it's tough because there might be disincentives to join. You might say, I'd like to stay out and make the money of transferring these items to the people who are otherwise prohibited. And it's difficult to monitor, and you have questions, how does an industry association enforce its rules? Is it sufficient to kick somebody out of the association? Could you do it contractually? How do we make those arrangements? In the United States, our export administration regulations are administered by the Bureau of Industry and Security, the BIS of the Department of Commerce, and it has certain parameters in terms of the technology that's controlled, the destination. So destinations are selected politically based on the trustworthiness to the United States government of those other governments. The end user and the proposed use, so you have to have information about that. The United States, interestingly, has not implemented some proposed Wassenaar-based controls that the United States worked on because of industry objections, because the industry objected and said, if you impose those controls, you will make first of all of software development impossible, but also defense against bad guys impossible. And so those controls were objected to by United States industry people, and they haven't been put in place by the United States. Interesting, with the 2015 U.S. proposed implementation, would have said we'll have exceptions for transfers to U.S. companies and subsidiaries of U.S. companies in foreign countries. So again, looking at personality, who the person is, rather than just territoriality or geography, and also end users in certain allied countries. And then presumptive denial, we're not going to allow you to send out these zero-day exploit capabilities that allow you to access somebody's computer without their consent. The EU regime has 27 member states. Each state has to impose at least its level of restriction, but can impose more, and Germany has done that. And there are also some proposed revisions that people have been working on to restrict, not just for ordinary security reasons, but for human rights reasons, not to send to a government that might abuse its own citizens. And interestingly, Sweden and a group of 8 other countries have opposed that because, partly at least, because they're concerned that that will make the EU a less competitive place to develop software if they have those restrictions that they operate under. So, as I suggested, national regimes are limited. You can't block this alone unless you have a monopoly on the technology, and that doesn't seem to be technically true at this moment in time. And also, there's global movement of software. So if you want to send the software to, let's say, from the United States to, say, the United Kingdom, then you have to be able to control where it goes from the United Kingdom, re-export of that software. So it looks like what you might call a weakest link public goods game. Whoever has it and lets it go, it's gone. And so you have to have everyone who might have it cooperate in restricting that. And so that's tough to do. And one question, as I suggested, is what are the incentives to any one player to comply with that arrangement? So the Wassenaar regime is limited in the number of countries that participate, although a number of countries apply the Wassenaar rules even if they're not members of the regime. Interestingly, the 42 countries that are in Wassenaar now include Russia, but the other 3, Iran, North Korea, and China, are not members. And a number of other countries, obviously, are not members. And the idea is to control arms, but also to control these so-called dual-use technologies, and this type of software would come under the heading of a dual-use technology. And the idea is simply to have among these countries a coordinated list of controlled items. And interestingly, this is an informal regime. It's not a formal treaty that is binding at formal international law. That doesn't mean it doesn't change behavior, but it's not part of the international legal system per se. And under this regime, each state retains discretion to sell whatever it wants. It doesn't have formal dispute settlement to interpret the categories, which sometimes can be contentious, and it doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. The predecessor organization, the COCOM, did include an obligation of prior notification before you sent a controlled item to a target state, and veto rights for other states. It was still non-binding. It wasn't a treaty, but it had that informal, stricter approach. And one of the issues that one might observe in the Wassenaar arrangement, and it was probably true of COCOM as well, is insufficient inclusion of the private sector and checking in to see what works in these arrangements. So the problem, to summarize, it's a limited group of countries, variations in enforcement, risks of defection, problems in definition. It's really tough, as Herb said, to come up with a definition of controlled software that is not either overbroad or under-inclusive. Probably there's a way to do it, but you'd have to do it very dynamically, and you'd have to come up with an institutional way to carry out that dynamism. So our idea is to come up with, as I said, a modified regime that draws a lot from some aspects of the existing regime, that focuses on the identity of the transferee, and two precedents in United States regulation are first the ENC exception for internal transfers to sister companies in other countries. So if, let's say, General Motors wants to transfer some software capabilities to its subsidiary in Germany, it can do that. And transfers to other private sector end users in so-called favorable treatment countries, which are basically the NATO countries and other similar countries. And then another example, another precedent, is the validated end user exception, which is in operation for India and China, where you pre-validate the transferees and then say, once we pre-validate the transferees, you can send the stuff to them without specific licenses. And by the way, as part of the development of those programs, they, in effect, pre-validate the host country and make sure that the host country is suitable. So hopefully you can read this. There are three conditions for three major conditions for validated end users. First is a due diligence investigation of the transferee itself, including what its internal safeguards are. So we say, is this a person that we can trust? Second is an agreement of the person that you're transferring it to accept monitoring and auditing by somebody, either the exporting government or some private validated person, some private certified person, or perhaps some host country inspectors who have been certified. And then finally, an agreement by the host country that they'll respect these limitations, that they won't coerce that entity that received the software to divulge it. And so this isn't absolutely leak-proof, but the idea is that it will create significant deterrence for transfer. And these aren't nuclear secrets, they're intrusion software, and so it's not the end of the world. And if we can create significant restrictions on transfer, perhaps that will be sufficient. As Herb said, there's a question: if your entity in, let's say, China has this software, and then there's a hack, let's say, in Sweden, we have the question, how do we know whether there was a leak, whether the export controls were violated? And that's why these questions, each of us learns a new word once in a while. Bertillonage and stylometry were new words for me, but that's why those kinds of things are interesting and important. Can we identify? It's a double attribution problem. Can we identify the state that did the intrusion? And can we identify who leaked the software to that state? So that's what we would need to do to enforce these kinds of rules. So it may be that there would be a natural incentive for states to join because they would want to have these transfers of technology come into their country, especially for developing countries. That might be an attractive thing for them to promote an indigenous software development industry. So this structure would have some natural internal penalties for violation. And it could be that you could have a naming and shaming type of operation. We'll hear more about that from Marty and from Duncan in their paper tomorrow. But something like that has been done with fair effectiveness in the OECD harmful tax practices operation. So it's possible to have some enforcement along those lines. So to conclude, This approach that we've outlined focuses on the identity of the transferee as opposed to the territoriality. It involves some public-private partnership, the transferee and the host state working together to accept the restrictions of the home state. You might say, that seems a little bit coercive or extraterritorial, but maybe it's an appropriate condition for this type of transfer. And so this approach is within a broader regime. You'd need primary rules. These export controls would be supportive of those primary rules by limiting proliferation of these types of technologies. So one of the things I hope we're all doing is thinking about the different panels today and tomorrow and how they work together, how they integrate with one another. And so there would be a need to think about a primary norm or a set of primary norms. Attribution, as I've said, is essential, and you have a dual attribution problem in this context. Standards are related. One question that we might ask the prior panel is, could you set a standard for watermarking or for allowing, I love using the word, Bertillonage or stylometry, allowing those things to operate. Vulnerability disclosure is part of this. We'll talk about that with Tina Iotis tomorrow. The Wassenaar arrangement now excludes vulnerability disclosures that are bona fide from export controls. Compliance, as I've said, is an important issue, and one question is, how would this be housed in an international organization, or could it be done in the Wassenaar arrangement as it now stands? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joel and Ian, for including me in this wonderful gathering and this conference. I'm grateful for the opportunity to review my knowledge of the Wassenaar Agreement and COCOM, which sounds like a 1980s video game manufacturer. And thank you, Joel and Herb, for this paper. Trying to respond to anything that people like Joel and Herb, who's been just at this for so many years and is just aware of so many different angles, there's a kind of learned helplessness in trying to reply in any way that would bring up a point they hadn't already considered and dismissed. It's a kind of futility that calls to mind attempts to use export controls to deal with the flow of software across borders. So I feel like it's almost a fair challenge to try to respond, because they've taken up a really important and difficult problem. And I must say it's especially bold, given the history of what we might call cyber law, to be invoking export controls for anything, given the metaphorical post-traumatic stress disorder of the crypto wars of the 1990s. If I'm to break down the presentations you just saw and the paper, of course, that they represent, thinking about the application of export controls here to prevent the undue spread of intrusion, we should say related software, there are two categories. One, what if it works? And two, what if it doesn't work? What if it works is a concern about it being too powerful, restricting the flow of software that shouldn't be restricted to people that maybe ought to be able to have it. And the fact that the software in question may be capable of dual use is one that makes this an especially worrisome issue. And there's a lot that Joel and Herb have done to make progress on that question, certainly since the framework of the 1990s, especially the maneuver that they highlighted in their presentation today of shifting attention not just from the definition of what is covered, but thinking about to whom is it given. And by being able to apply a filter to whom it is given, it means that you could make it cover more, because people that can demonstrate themselves in a position to be able to peaceably receive it, in theory at least, would be able still then to receive and use it. So I think that's a really useful contribution alone, thinking about where and how to draw lines and to basically use a different dimension other than just what is going to be covered by this control. But even with that, there's still, I think, a fair question to really try to explore about the nature of the software in question that would be covered by this regime and the market. And there's part of that that's discussed in the paper that was adverted to. This is intrusion versus intrusion related, that software that is the literal software that can get past a door, to put it metaphorically, has so many manifold dual uses, that we might not want to include that on the list. And hence we get the idea of separating the payload, the bomb, from the bomber. Well, let's restrict the plane that delivers the bomb, but still let everybody have a bomb, but if you don't have a plane, you can't do much with it, which makes the metaphor actually terrible when I think about it, because a bomb without a plane is still quite dangerous. But here the software would not be, is the theory. The only problem there is even making those divisions is quite tough. It may be turtles all the way up, because in order to do good security management, you need to figure out what kind of plane might drop the bomb, which you need the plane to kick the tires and the wings, which means the same problem that had us make the separation to begin with might ask us derivatively to make other separations. Another question about the market is, for the software that we are worried about, how esoteric is it? How hard to make is it? And of course, these are factors that Wassenaar, in its implementation, considers across the board when it thinks about what's worthy of trying to impose export controls. But here then, we really are called to ask, is this software that Herb was mentioning, I don't think it was Chatham House rule, but when we were chatting beforehand, that in high school he'd been known, it's long past the statute of limitations, to have intruded into computers even before an internet. He was hacking around with stuff using proprietary protocols. And all right, Herb no doubt was an extraordinary high school student, but if it's still science fair territory, you do wonder whether an export regime makes a whole lot of sense. Now, if the dial is set factually more towards regular old munitions, for which whatever you can brew up with the anarchist's cookbook pales in comparison, I would hope, for taxpayer money purposes, to what Northrop Grumman can build. If it's Northrop Grumman's of the world, all right, they have a compliance office, we know how to tell them what to do and what not to do if only we can overcome some of the coordination and other problems familiar to arms control that Joel was talking about at the end of his remarks. So I would love to have a better sense of the empirical question here. Stuxnet does not appear to be off the shelf. On the other hand, a lot of the tools, perhaps the ones, for example, used to intrude upon Sony, may have been much more a combination of social engineering and then just by-the-book stuff, for which trying to touch it with an agreement like this would be much more difficult. And in fact, it opens up the question, the kind of, I should say, the GNU in the room, which is, all right, free and open source software. Now again, my learned helplessness tells me that this is not going to be like, oh my God, time to shred the paper. There will be an answer to this, and if I had to figure out what that answer likely is, right, doing intrusion detection on the intellectual surface here, I guess it would be the existence of locksmiths is no argument against locks. It's still worthy to try to raise the costs, to make a market have to be a gray market or a black market rather than just advertise the availability of these really cool security testing tools, hint, hint, and let anybody hang out a shingle to do it. This is the kind of regime that could say, yeah, if somebody wants to do a free and open source software sort of thing, it may be very hard to subject it to this kind of regime, certainly to require of them that they put in all sorts of watermarking to make sure that the right person that the GitHub repository owners were vetting under this didn't give it to anyone. I mean, it's, but fine, let it be on GitHub. Let it be not so common and advertised. But again, that also means what's the shape of the market here? When guns are outlawed, only criminals will have guns. I put that in quotes rather than attributing that claim to myself. But that theory is the theory that says, here, if the use of these tools are by bound and determined parties, state actors, in fact, that aren't bound by what is remunerative to them. They have other foreign policy goals that might make them really want to go to great efforts to get tools to wreak the kind of havoc that this regime would be trying to prevent. All right, they'll go on GitHub and get it, in which case the locksmith argument may not be as powerful. But another area where there may be actually easier grip is product versus service. And here I think the metaphor to munitions is a disservice, because these aren't exactly objects that get buffed and shined and they're dangerous and then you ship them digitally somewhere. Oftentimes these are things that are maintained. They're services of a certain kind, and to the extent that that's the case, there may be sophisticated service providers that you don't just find by downloading something off a repo, and that lends itself much more to the kind of regulatory intervention that Joel and Herb's paper is talking about. Now, pulling back just one more step, there is an interesting question about whether export regime is even the vehicle to be thinking about here. Both because what's to stop somebody from creating the Delaware Corporation tomorrow, Security R Us? They're a domestic purchaser. They go to Northrop Grumman, which is, I'm trying to give us the favorable software landscape here. They're like, hi, we'd like to get your worst stuff and we're ready to pay cash. Like, wait a minute, are you foreign? Because if you're foreign, we're going to have to do some diligence on who you are. No, we're Delaware. Great, here it is. Well, that's a problem. Now, again, it's not like, this is not a problem they have not heard of, but I would like to hear, actually, how they would respond to the problem of, are we really creating, ultimately, a global whitelist of entities that would be permitted to be buyers, and the domestic-foreign distinction starts to evaporate? Or do we say, no, it's just overseas from the source country jurisdiction, in which case you have the loophole of the cutout, and that's, to me, a real problem. Finally, I want to not be too smug about acknowledging that this is a really hard problem they've taken on, and to say, this problem is going to recur in other areas where I find my urgency professionally much higher. I've been following with interest the case around 3D printed guns and the transmission of information there. Many of the equities of that case track the equities of a hypothetical intrusion related piece of software here. And very interesting to see that the intervention there is under export control law through the State Department. And many of the worries about, gosh, people could print out a gun that would get through a gun detector, and the fact that it might only be good for one bullet is small solace. That makes it feel like the stakes are higher than they were in the 90s when we were talking about, oh, states just fear people having a conversation they can't readily monitor. And of course, the same is true of CRISPR and other technologies that are going to end up being a Napster for blank, for which thinking about the flow of bits has so much implication in the physical world that the analogy to munitions may be so powerful again that maybe this isn't really about an export regime at the end of the day. It's about just flat-out regulation of when states will allow private parties to develop, transfer, and use some of these technologies. And then it's just export control is the car we happen to be riding in right now, because that's a big enough problem rather than imagining something more comprehensive. Thank you.
So we have 15 minutes, and we want to open up for questions. And if you have any questions, we have a microphone up there, and you can ask away.
I began thinking in my security model, and I began thinking about threat models from the proposal you had. And one thing that comes to mind is that country A, let's say Russia, for example, wants to create tension between the US and another country. So it steals the software from somewhere. It could steal it from the other country, it could steal it from, but it makes it appear as if the software has come from a country that has received this, and therefore creates some tension. What I would like to know is whether you've thought any about the threats that arise out of your model, aside from the one that I've just posited, and what risks it creates, security risks, security writ large, not just cyber, but also diplomatic and so on.
Hi, hello?
Yeah, this is that thing. Take this and take over. No.
There you go. Okay, there you go. Never trust technology. So I understand I understand why you're asking the question, and it's a good question. It relates to something that Jonathan said too, which is that why is it? How did he put it? Well, no, not so much additional risk, but sort of this sort of helps. It helps a little bit. Perhaps this is another approach that helps on the margin. I got the feeling listening to Jonathan, that he would have been much happier saying, look, the idea of a CCL, commerce control list, a dual use technology list, and so on, as something to be export control, is a silly idea, and we should get rid of it. Okay. Now, I don't know if I want to put those words into your mouth, but there are lots of people who say that. Was that basically what you were saying in this? You came close to that.
Perhaps. I want to consult with counsel first, but
okay.
yes.
Okay. And one could make an argument for that. Okay. So it's the dual use list it's a list of technologies products that can be used in multiple, for military and civilian purposes, and there are lots of flaws with it, okay? And what we were trying to do is do something a little bit better in that. Now, are we rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic? Well, that's an open question. We could have that discussion, but I guarantee you that the dual use list is not going away. So given that we're stuck with it, it might make sense to try to do a little bit better. The kinds of issues that you raised, there are indeed all these kinds of issues there. You could make trouble, but I think that the answer, my answer to that would be that it's at a low enough level that, that as Joel said, it's not, you're not talking about nuclear weapons here. It's not a big deal.
Can I just add to that? I think it's a real question, and I saw Nicholas Sigurius nodding his head at your question, because it's a question of what burden of proof you would want for attribution. How much are you worried about false flags, and can you discern them? And as Herb said, and as you suggest, it's a question of how good is our stylometry and Bertillonage? I love using those words. How reliable is our ability to tell, and can a bad actor use a false flag operation? So I think it's a good question. If there's no answer to it, then we've got a serious problem. It may be that in some circumstances there is a good answer to it.
Let me amplify just a little bit on that. I'm personally somewhat pessimistic about the idea of software provenance, okay, of being a rigorous sort of an exercise. I think it's really, really hard to do, and to do that in any kind of consistent and reliable way. But you get some. Just, you and I have had this discussion over, does restricting crypto to the bad guys, restricting crypto make it?
Good guys.
It does restricting crypto, what are the symptoms significance of restricting crypto? And some people say, well, the smart guys are going to get the crypto anyway, and you only get the dumb guys. I mean, various people say, we'll talk, if you don't believe that you said that, I can probably find that. But it's the same sort of thing. Having a little bit of an effect, even it's with the people who can't deal with the provenance issue, circumventing the provenance issues, that's helpful.
Add something. So I also want to tack on to Herb. Yes, I know I'm moderating this, but I could not you know, the whole time I was thinking, you know, this whole idea of watermarking and provenance, I mean, it seems like there's so many parallels with digital rights management, DRM, and as we know, it's defective by design.
And yet, DRMs do have some effect on impeding the flow of information that would go on if they weren't there.
Yeah, I think there's an issue, I mean, a risk or more threats of, say, the good guys exercise extraterritorial enforcement. So they can be enthused, actually, to exercise extraterritorial enforcement. My question is, I think for a regulatory regime, it's very important to consider whether the duty to prevent is a duty, an absolute duty of result, or a duty of conduct, a due diligence duty. For example, because that changes, if you like, the regulatory regime. If you have an agreement between the exporting state and the receiving state, but it's based on due diligence, then if the state was diligent, but of course there was theft, etc., and you have leakage, then you continue to export. So you don't exercise enforcement. So I think it's very important to see what we mean by the duty to prevent.
It's an important question. Many, you know, there's a non-software analog to these types of questions in connection with export controls and in other areas of the law. The way the United States export controls work is that a firm has a duty of due diligence, not an eventual duty to prevent the diversion of goods. And you know, just to mention Jonathan's point about the Delaware Corporation, you know, you have a duty to look for red flags that Delaware Corporation is a fake corporation, and indeed that Delaware Corporation has a duty not to re-export. But I think the main point that these things can't be certain is a good one, and as Herb has said, and as we've recognized, it's just to increase the costs of transfer, and I think, and maybe your question was about the obligations of states, and I think there again we would say that a state's obligation is one of due diligence. You can't, it may be that you structure your rules as strict liability in order to maximize the due diligence, but really what we're after in all of these cases is a reasonable standard of care.
Hi. So as you presented today, Gabby Raymond. I'm a cybersecurity engineer at the MITRE Corporation, and I'm particularly interested in creative misuse of technologies. So as you guys presented today, you're looking at like one software with one author, and I feel like that's not always representative of what the real world is. So I was wondering if you guys had considered what happens when you have the composition of more than one piece of software, more than one author, and since we like analogies, if you have vinegar, you know, that's innate on its own, and baking soda also doesn't necessarily look malicious, but when you put the two together, you have a big explosion.
So in the scheme that we're talking about, what I mentioned was software objects, and the idea, I mean, how you define a software object in this business, I agree, is complicated. But certainly, if you're talking about, are you talking about objects that might be recombined, you know, like several of them put together and then sent out in a package, or what? I'm not quite sure I get what your question is.
Yeah, all of the above. So I think my concern and point is if you have two different authors and they're both like, well, my code is good, mine, I don't have any malicious aspect of it, but, you know, paired with this other piece of software, oh, look, something bad happened, then you can point to the other author and say, it must be them, but both on their own look good.
I think that the idea behind this is that the way the export control regime is structured, and maybe what you're trying to point out is a difficulty with the entire export control regime, which is that it controls individual entities,
Right.
as opposed to colluding entities or something like that. And if what you're doing is you're complaining about the fact that the export control regime only targets individual entities,
Right.
then I have no. I mean, you're absolutely correct. Somebody can export ammonium nitrate, and somebody can export something, fertilizer and fuel oil, and they put them together, you get a bond. I mean, that's true, and that's not a problem you're ever going to solve.
Okay, thank you.
One of the debates in this area is about whether to control integrated platforms that are ready to go versus individual components. And I suppose that's really just a question of how you define what's controlled. How readily can it be converted into a weapon?
Hi, Ben Janis, a Tufts student, and also an engineer at MITRE. I'll give it the yes. This definitely would have some positive impact on restricting flow of information, but cost benefit, how much of a negative impact is it going to have? So when you look at every single major vulnerability that comes out, whether it's Stuxnet, whether it's the WannaCry virus, whether it's Spectre meltdown, the whole cybersecurity community blows up across the world. Everyone's doubles down and tries to figure it out, and you never know where the solution is going to come from. With WannaCry, it was a 18, 20-year-old boy in England. And all of this is, they're sharing these viruses, they're passing all around this very dangerous material back and forth, but all in the pursuit of trying to solve it. So knowing that you never know where the solution is going to come from, how do you allow this fast, rapid reaction across the globe, across these different various actors who you don't even know who's who, without forcing them to go through very specific channels where they have to go, maybe even talk to a government every time they want to send their friend the vulnerability?
The criticism that you're making was, in fact, one of the criticisms made in the original U.S. proposal to control it. And after a lot of people like you complained, the U.S. government said, you're right. And they essentially carved out an exception for vulnerability researchers. I mean, so that's in the spirit of what you're talking about. And so if you're trying to get us to defend the original proposal, you're not going to succeed.
Thanks very much, Herb and Joel. I'm James Shires. I'm a cybersecurity research fellow at the Harvard Belfer Center. I really want to push you on Jonathan's point about the distinction between these sort of technologies as a product and a service, because the fact of it being serviced and continually maintained is an important part of the constraints against overreach within the Wassenaar Arrangement Amendment itself. But if you look at the companies that sell these technologies, often they try and play off this distinction between product and service. To their customers, they claim it's a service. To the governments and regulators, they claim it's a product, and to human rights organizations as well. So they try and maneuver between these two. I just wondered how you thought that fitted into this question.
Again, the issue is a question of distinguishing between products and services in this. And every product is essentially a chit against a service everywhere, anyway. And so you could make exactly the same argument about anything that's controlled. So our attempt in all of this is to reduce the problem to yet a different unsolved problem, which is exactly the point that you raised. What you say is exactly right, but there's no. You can't deal with that with an export control product regime at all.
Services can be subject to export controls as well, and I think the problem that Jonathan and you are highlighting is the question of how do you define what you're controlling, and can you have an objective standard instead of leaving it to the seller to characterize what they're selling. And it definitely puts pressure on a system to do that, but I wonder whether it's impossible to characterize it in a legally effective way.
So we are out of time. The clock strikes 0. So thank you so much John, to Joel, and to Herb. Thank you so much for the panel. Before we go, so what we're going to do is there is a little gift for Herb. And to John.
It's a USB key.
And what we're going to do is we're going to take a break for the next panel, but for those who have questions for the panel, we can do so. Thank you.